How did the Germans go from this to this in just a few short years? The war that started with light tanks and assault guns would end with outright bizarre designs featuring enormous armor and firepower. We're going to show you how and why that happened and tell you everything you didn't know about the most important and infamous German tank destroyers of the Second World War, ranging from light and small to absurdly heavy. The armor and firepower kept increasing year after year, following a simple concept: the more, the better. To understand how the Germans ended up with vehicles that looked like anything but normal, we have to look at the idea itself. Before the war, the Germans mounted short-barreled 7.5cm guns for infantry support on tank chassis without turrets, creating what they called Sturmgeschütz, or what we call assault guns. As the war progressed, this idea evolved. When faced with better and more numerous enemy tanks, they began mounting anti-tank guns instead of low-velocity infantry support cannons. This gave birth to the Panzerjäger, meaning tank hunter. The key difference between them and regular tanks was the turret. Tanks had rotating turrets, while assault guns and tank destroyers had their main guns fixed directly into the hull. Building a turret significantly complicated tank production, while mounting a gun in a fixed casemate and welding an armored superstructure around it was a much faster and more cost-effective approach. The Germans eventually applied this concept to almost every tank they produced, except the Tiger I. The Sturmgeschütz III, or just Stug for short. This was the most produced German combat vehicle of the entire war, with over 10,000 units built, manufactured continuously from 1939 until Germany's defeat in 1945. The Stug was initially designed as an assault gun to support advancing infantry with direct fire, blasting bunkers, machine gun nests, and fortifications. The assault gun could follow the motorized infantry and be right when and where needed, which field artillery couldn't do. Remarkably, German command specifically instructed that it not be used as a tank destroyer because they believed it was too vulnerable for that role. Even though they were not expected to counter armor and had a low-velocity gun, they carried a couple of armor-piercing and high-explosive anti-tank shells just in case, alongside a few smoke rounds, but the majority were standard high-explosive. That was when the Stug was armed with a short-barreled Howitzer pattern 75mm gun designed for firing low-velocity high-explosive shells. But early in Operation Barbarossa, Germans were shocked when they realized that Soviet tanks like T-34 and KV-1 were better than all their early tanks and in huge numbers, and they immediately needed something to destroy these enormous Soviet Banzai tank charges. So the Stug was now upgraded with the longer, higher velocity 75mm L-43 gun, and later to the even more potent L-48. Although they now didn't have that high explosive capability they were designed for, Stugs could now punch through T-34 armor at combat ranges. The removed short-barreled 75mm guns found new life mounted on Hanomag 251 half-tracks called the Stummel. This vehicle that shouldn't fight tanks ended up destroying an estimated 30,000 Soviet tanks, more than any other German combat vehicle and more than any Allied tank type. In 1943, near Leningrad, a single Stug battalion equipped with 41 vehicles destroyed 221 Russian T-34 and KV-1 tanks while losing only 13 of their own. Famous German tank ace Kurt Knispel destroyed over 160 enemy tanks, and many of them were actually using Stugs. But how did this happen? First, the Stug was astonishingly cost-effective. Without a turret, it required much fewer materials and man-hours to build. A Stug cost 70,000 Reichsmarks compared to 100,000 for a Panzer IV and a staggering 300,000 for a Tiger. It was built on the already familiar Panzer III chassis, sharing a lot of the same parts, just with a fixed casemate instead of a turret allowing it to mount a much bigger gun. Second, the Stug had a remarkably low profile, less than the height of a standing man. This made it easier to conceal and presented a smaller target to enemy gunners. In the defensive battles that characterized the later war years, this ambush capability proved devastatingly effective. Third, when the Stug mounted the high-velocity 75mm gun, it could still penetrate the frontal armor of most Allied tanks. Fourth, the Stug had superior optics compared to the Panzer IV, allowing it to engage targets more accurately and quicker at greater distances. Finally, without a turret and with strategically placed armor focused on the frontal arc where it was most needed, the Stug was lighter and more agile. This reduced strain on its drivetrain, resulting in fewer breakdowns and the highest availability rating of any German tracked combat vehicle, which is one of the most important features. Later variants had steel side skirts called Schürzen mounted away from the hull. This provided them a defense against Soviet anti-tank rifles that could penetrate the Stug's thinner side armor and later proved effective against shape-charge weapons like the American bazooka and British Piat. A Soviet anti-tank rifle round could go through the Stug's side skirts, but this would make it tumble and lose the force needed to penetrate the main armor. Stugs served on all fronts, from Russia to North Africa and Western Europe to Italy, as assault guns and tank destroyers. Despite its remarkable combat record, the Stug never achieved the iconic status of the Tiger and Panther. It was plain-looking and less capable on paper than its turreted cousins, but in the reality of war, it was responsible for a disproportionately high number of tank kills compared to all other German vehicles. What's often overlooked is that the Stug wasn't even operated by traditional tank crews. Because it was technically artillery, the crews were trained gunners, not tankers, yet they ended up becoming the most effective tank killers of the entire German military. Stug battalions became a sort of elite units, very well trained and respected. By the war's end, German assault and self-propelled guns had surpassed panzers in tactical importance. They were cheaper and faster to build, and frequently replaced tanks within panzer battalions as losses mounted and resources dwindled. The Stug proved ideal for the massive defensive battles fought on the Eastern Front, as well as in Italy and Normandy. The Stug 4 appeared using the more robust Panzer IV chassis, but keeping the same concept. When Allied strategic bombing severely damaged factories, Germans had to make use of tank parts they had, combining different hulls and guns. The Sturmhubitzer 42 variant even had a 105mm howitzer mounted for significant high-explosive firepower. Germany could have built twice as many Stugs instead of pursuing Tigers and Panthers, and the Eastern Front or even the whole war might have looked very different. But we'll never know. This wasn't a flawless design, however, and it had its limitations, but it worked well enough to be incredibly effective on the battlefield, and in the end, that's the only metric that truly counts. The Stug was almost completely overlooked and overshadowed by other German tanks despite being the most produced and probably the best armored vehicle Germans had. Among many infamous tanks of World War II, there's a smaller, deadlier, and far more disturbing vehicle that deserves our attention. The Jagdpanther 38T, better known as the Hetzer, might look cute and compact in your video games, but for the men inside, it was anything but adorable. Hetzer translates roughly to chaser, a fitting nickname for a small aggressive tank destroyer designed to ambush and harass enemy armor. By 1943, Germany was in serious trouble as new Soviet tanks emerged that were better than almost anything Germans had. The tide of war had turned against them, and they desperately needed something that could be mass-produced while still being able to threaten the enormous production of Allied tanks. To make the most of what they had, the Germans began repurposing older tank designs, turning them into something new. If they had some hulls and guns, they would put them together to make the best use of both. And that's how Marder and Nashorn tank destroyers were born. However, their high silhouettes and thin armor made them too vulnerable, so the Germans wanted something to fix this, or at least to try. The Hetzer was built on the chassis of the Czechoslovakian-designed 38T tank, just like the Marder III, but with a completely different design. German engineers essentially took this outdated light tank, took off its turret, slightly widened the hull, and mounted a fixed casemate with a powerful Puck 39 75mm anti-tank gun. The gun was actually one of the best anti-tank guns of the war, and under 1,000 meters it could destroy most of the Allied armor, besides the rare heavy tanks. However, the gun could traverse only 5 degrees to the left and 11 to the right. Anything beyond that required moving the entire vehicle, which risked giving away its position. But we'll come to that. Development began in 1943, with mass production starting around April 1944. By war's end, approximately 2,500 of these weird machines had rolled off the assembly lines. But the real story is about the men who had to fight inside what was called a mobile coffin. The first thing that strikes you about the Hetzer is its absurdly small size. At around 7 feet tall, the Hetzer was still one of the lowest profile tank destroyers of the war, making it ideal for ambushes, hiding behind hedgerows or in forests to surprise advancing Allied tanks. But that low silhouette came at a horrifying cost for the crew. 4 men were crammed into a fighting compartment barely big enough for 2. The driver was in the front, of course, and the gunner and loader in a row behind him, squeezed on the same side of the cannon. This arrangement made operating the vehicle in combat awkward, as loader and gunner were one beside another, although the usual arrangement would be loader on one and gunner on the other side so both could function better. Imagine trying to load a shell while practically sitting in your colleague's lap. The loader also had some of the rounds stored on the opposite side of the gun breech and had to reach over the recoil guard after firing, grab a new shell, and then load the gun. But the cramped quarters were just the beginning of the crew's problems. The real horror was the near-total blindness they operated in. Although all World War II tanks didn't have the best visibility from inside, the Hetzer took it to a new level. You're inside a vehicle designed to hunt and destroy enemy tanks, and your life depends on seeing threats before they see you. But your visibility is limited to a few tiny vision slits and a single periscope. There are no side vision ports, no commander's cupola, no way to see if infantry is approaching your flanks. The driver peered through a tiny vision port at the front. The gunner had only his gun sight, and the loader couldn't see outside at all. And the commander, who was responsible for identifying targets and directing the vehicle, had just a small scissor periscope through his partially blocked hatch. One Hetzer veteran described the experience as fighting while wearing a blindfold and earmuffs simultaneously. The crew depended almost entirely on the commander to be their eyes, but he could only see properly when standing up through his hatch completely exposed. This made the Hetzer exceptionally vulnerable to infantry attacks. If enemy got close to the sides of the vehicle, the crew had no way to see them, no way to depress or turn the main gun to fire at them, and no defensive weapons except for a single remote-controlled machine gun on the roof. Remote, you may ask. Speaking of that, it's an engineering solution so absurd it almost seems like a practical joke played on Hetzer crews. The vehicle had an MG-34 mounted on the roof that could be fired remotely from inside via a system of cables and pulleys. In theory, this gave the crew some protection against infantry attacks without exposing themselves. In practice, it was almost useless. The gun couldn't be aimed with any accuracy, and also it couldn't be reloaded from inside the vehicle. Once you'd emptied the 50 or 75 round drum, someone had to open the hatch and climb onto the roof to reload. You can imagine doing that in the middle of combat. The Hetzer's armor layout was just as contradictory as the rest of its design. The front armor was impressively thick at 60 mm and well sloped, making it capable of deflecting direct hits from many Allied tank or anti-tank guns. This gave crews a sense of security until they realized the sides were only 20 mm thick and the top a paper-thin 8 mm. That means the sides could be easily penetrated by Soviet anti-tank rifles, of which they had over 2 million, and even heavy machine guns would go through, like the American .50 caliber. The top armor could barely stop standard rifle rounds. A direct hit from any Allied anti-tank weapon to the side would go through as if there was no armor. And remember, with their limited visibility, Hetzer crews in close quarters fighting couldn't even see if they were being flanked. As if fighting blind in a cramped box wasn't bad enough, the Hetzer was also mechanically strained to its limits. The original chassis was designed to support a 10-ton light tank, but the Hetzer weighed 16 tons. The suspension was overloaded, especially in early models, which were visibly sagging at the front from the combined weight of the armor and gun. Although engineers made improvements, the vehicle was always overloaded and underpowered. This logically made the Hetzer slow and cumbersome, and it couldn't even keep pace with motorized infantry units. Just when you thought the Hetzer couldn't get more horrifying for its crews, German engineers said, "Hold my schnaps," and created the Flammpanzer 38T, a flamethrower variant that saw some action on the Western Front. About 50 of these nightmares were produced, replacing the main gun with a flamethrower that could project burning fuel about 60 meters. If the standard Hetzer was a death trap, the Flammpanzer was a rolling crematorium, when you add a highly flammable mixture to all its problems. Plus, to be effective, flamethrowers need to get extremely close to their targets, meaning crews had to drive to within point-blank range of enemy positions. You'll be driving a blind box filled with liquid fire toward heavily armed enemies who will do anything to kill you before you get close enough to use your weapon. It's no surprise that many of these flamethrower variants were abandoned intact by crews who simply refused to take them into combat. During the 1944 Warsaw Uprising, Polish resistance fighters captured one Hetzer from German forces and used it to defend a barricade against German tanks. Although technically impressive in some ways, especially when you look at it just on paper, the Hetzer was a nightmare for the men who operated it. It was cheap to produce, had a powerful gun and a low profile that made it harder to spot and hit, seeming like a reasonable solution to Germany's desperate need for tank destroyers. But military vehicles are homes and workplaces for human beings who must fight effectively inside them, and in that most critical aspect, the Hetzer failed its crews spectacularly. By the time they reached the battlefield in significant numbers in late 1944, Germany was already losing on all fronts. This meant Hetzer crews were fighting defensive battles against overwhelming odds. However, this doesn't mean they were completely useless. In the right hands, they destroyed dozens of Allied tanks in well-executed ambushes. However, they couldn't make a dent against Allied mass tank production and Germany's rapidly deteriorating situation. Today, military historians and tank enthusiasts may admire the Hetzer for its innovative design and impressive production numbers, but we should never forget the young men who suffered and died inside these metal boxes, not just Hetzers, but all other armored vehicles of the war. Remember, behind every impressive statistic and sleek design lies a human story that's often far more terrifying than the spec sheet suggests. So how and why was the Jagdpanther born? It all started when the Germans were trying to mount the new Pak-43 L-71 gun on a tank platform. The Tiger II was using it very effectively, and it was one of the most powerful anti-tank guns of the war. But Tiger II was simply too expensive and complicated to build in large numbers. The turretless tank destroyer concept, on the other hand, proved much more cost-effective. The Pak-43 was an improved version of the famous 88 that the Tiger I had. It fired the same projectile but with a longer barrel and a bigger cartridge, giving it extreme muzzle velocity. For comparison, the Tiger I's 88 could penetrate 120 mm of 60-degree sloped armor at 100 meters, which was already more than enough to make the Tiger a feared tank. Under the same conditions, however, the new 88 could go through 202 mm of armor. But the real difference comes at long range, where at 2,000 meters, the older 88's penetration drops to 84 mm, while the new one could go through 132. So to put it simply, the new gun could penetrate more armor at 2,000 meters than the older one could at just 100 meters. And with new heavy Allied tanks emerging, like the Soviet IS-2, the Germans wanted to mount this great gun onto a tank chassis and turn it into a designated tank killer. However, finding the right platform was not an easy task. It was first tried with the Nashorn, which worked quite well with the gun but had thin armor and a high silhouette, making it too vulnerable. Then, the Ferdinand overcompensated for this with its massive 70 tons and 200 mm of armor, but it was ultimately impractical, being notoriously slow, unreliable, and too heavy to cross most bridges. The Hetzer, Stug, and Jagdpanther IV were great destroyers/assault guns for mass production, but with thin armor and 7.5 cm guns in their most powerful configuration, they were already outdated. Now the Germans needed to combine all the best traits of these vehicles into one new tank destroyer. When trying to mount the Pak-43 onto a Panther chassis, they were surprised by how well it matched. The Panther was already a proven tank, and a fixed armored casemate was easily welded onto its hull. In short, after trials, errors, and refinements, the new heavy tank destroyer was born under the name Sonderkraftfahrzeug 173, meaning Special Purpose Vehicle 173, but it became better known as the Jagdpanther, or Hunter Panther in German. Production began in January 1944, but was constantly harassed by Allied strategic bombings. By mid-1944, only 46 Jagdpanthers had been made, which was far from the goal of 160 units per month. Production continued despite the lack of workers and resources, completing only 415 Jagdpanthers by the end of the war. However, despite their small numbers, they were about to achieve a horrific kill-to-loss ratio when put against advancing Allied tanks, but we'll get to that in a moment. Let's first explain what exactly set the Jagdpanther apart from other tank destroyers. The first was the gun we mentioned, with an extreme muzzle velocity of 3,400 feet per second, capable of destroying any tank the Allies had at ranges over 3,000 meters. Its frontal 80mm armor plate was sloped at 55 degrees, giving it serious protection from direct fire, especially at the range it was intended to operate. The sides and rear were 50mm thick and sloped at 60 degrees, also providing solid protection, while the roof and floor ranged from just 16 to 25mm, making it vulnerable to mines or artillery. A MG-34 mounted in the front right was manned by the radio operator, serving as protection against enemy infantry. Beside him were the commander, driver, gunner, and loader. The superstructure looked spacious from the outside, but inside, the massive gun breech, 60 shells, and 5 crew members were tightly packed together. Without a turret, the gun was in a fixed position with traverse limited to just 12 degrees left or right. However, since it was designed as a long-range tank killer, this traverse still allowed it to cover a 1-kilometer-wide field of fire at 2,000 meters. The Maybach high-performance V12 gasoline engine gave the 46-ton destroyer a top speed of 28 miles per hour, 46 kilometers per hour, even matching the mobility of the significantly lighter and less armored Sherman. However, reliability was another story. It was one of the most complex and modern machines of its time, and if not careful, the driver could easily destroy the Jagdpanther's fragile final drives, which happened quite often, especially when you add combat stress to a hastily trained 18-year-old conscript who had never driven a car before. Visibility and situational awareness inside the Jagdpanther were another issue. The commander had to lead the vehicle while sticking half of his body out of the hull to see, and he also had to assist the loader in handling the 50-pound shells for the main gun. Now, we need to understand how the Jagdpanther was meant to be used in combat. As Germany shifted to a defensive war, the Jagdpanther was meant to operate in specialized heavy tank destroyer battalions, tasked with breaking Allied tank attacks from long range. They were positioned defensively behind the main force to maximize their range advantage, and using them alone without proper flank protection from infantry and tanks was strictly forbidden. However, as the war turned against Germany, they were eventually forced into roles they weren't designed for, like urban and close quarters combat. As we mentioned, they were deployed in Normandy in bocage terrain, where fighting was at close range. They often fought in small squads or even alone without infantry protection. They had to constantly change positions to avoid counterfire from Allied artillery or attack aircraft and watch for bazooka teams trying to ambush them. The Allies quickly learned that the best way to deal with them was not to attack head-on with tanks, but rather to relay their position to artillery or attack aircraft and wait. However, Jagdpanthers executed several highly effective ambushes, destroying dozens of Allied tanks in rapid succession, only to later be found abandoned and burned or blown up by their own crews. The biggest enemy of the Jagdpanther was the deteriorating situation of the German army. They suffered from fuel and ammunition shortages, frequent mechanical breakdowns, and a lack of spare parts or the ability to repair them in the field. Although some claimed the Jagdpanther was unreliable, experienced crews loved it and argued that its mechanical failures were mostly due to inexperienced and poorly trained drivers who caused damage to the engine and transmission, which then couldn't be repaired. An interesting side note is that loaders were quite often injured in Jagdpanthers for some reason. When the gun was fired, the breech recoiled back significantly and could crush anything in its way, and sometimes that was the loader's leg or hand. But this was also probably due to poor training later in the war. On the Eastern Front, it was even worse. The Germans had to destroy everything they couldn't bring with them so it wouldn't fall into enemy hands, and Jagdpanthers were no exception. They fought with only a couple of shells and on a nearly empty gas tank. For example, the 563rd Heavy Tank Destroyer Battalion destroyed 53 Soviet tanks in one battle, only to be forced to blow up 12 of their Jagdpanthers that either broke down or ran out of fuel. In another instance, a lone Jagdpanther held back an entire Soviet armored column, destroying 12 tanks, until the crew ran out of fuel and ammunition and was forced to abandon and burn down their vehicle. The same happened in battles against the American and British armies in Western Europe, as seen in the Battle of the Bulge, where only a small portion of Jagdpanthers were actually destroyed by the Allies. They would cause severe damage and fight as long as they could, but the outcome was usually the same. A few Jagdpanthers were captured intact when their crews failed to destroy them, and the Allies were fascinated by their design. After the war, in captured factories, around a dozen Jagdpanthers were built under the supervision of Royal Engineers and shipped to England for evaluation. Some of their features were later incorporated into new Allied tanks, such as the Centurion and M48 Patton. One of these Jagdpanthers survived and is displayed at the Bovington Tank Museum. Post-war advancements in tank technology and the main battle tank concept led to the abandonment of turretless tank destroyers. Tanks with turrets could now take on the roles of light, medium, and heavy tanks, as well as tank destroyers, all in a single vehicle. Today, only 10 Jagdpanthers still exist, with 4 restored to running condition and displayed in museums across Europe. Germans tried out some ridiculous guns on tank platforms even earlier. The Sturer Emil and Dicker Max were prototypes with 12.8 and 10.5 centimeter guns and proved that mounting such huge guns on a mobile platform was possible, although they were abandoned as it was deemed absurd to do this at the time. By the summer of 1943, heavy Soviet tanks were emerging on the Eastern Front and concerned the Germans that even their infamous 88s are not going to be enough soon. Hitler, loving the absurdly powerful weapons, immediately supported the idea of a new ultra-heavy tank destroyer with the heaviest armor and firepower the world had ever seen. Starting the war only a couple of years before with the 37mm gun as main anti-tank weapon, they were now looking at the enormous 128mm Pak-44. At the same time, the Maus super heavy tank prototype was being developed and intended to use this gun. But with the 180-ton Maus still far from actually being realized, the Germans decided to take the gun and mount it onto something already existing. The first and biggest challenge was how can that be put on tracks, as it was simply too big and too heavy. The Tiger II chassis was chosen as the best option, and even that had to be extended for almost 2 feet from the original hull, so it could house this gun in a fixed superstructure. After many errors and trials, they came up with the heaviest vehicle of the Second World War. 225mm of frontal armor sloped at 75 degrees gave it protection from basically anything on the battlefield. 80mm sides were not invincible but still quite a solid protection. However, this protection came at a cost in weight, as the Jagdtiger now had about 75 tons combat ready. Good luck trying to cross bridges and not collapse them. It was powered by the same engine that the 20-ton lighter Tiger I had, pushed to about 600 horsepower. To make matters worse, it was paired with the already problematic transmission from the Tiger II. It is now not going to work better in an even heavier vehicle. This would turn out to be Jagdtiger's biggest issue, with a top speed of 12 miles per hour and completely destroying its transmission every 200 kilometers. If you want to replace it, you have to remove the entire main gun first. Try that in the field. The issue was so alarming that engineers were sent from factories to somehow find the solution for so often breakdowns, but there was nothing they could do as the vehicle was simply too heavy. However, nothing could prepare either the Germans or the Allies for what would actually happen in real combat. Jagdtiger's closest tank destroyer relative was the Ferdinand, later renamed Elephant. It was also extremely heavily armored with 200mm of frontal armor and armed with the powerful 88mm PaK-43 gun. However, it was even more plagued by many errors that were tried to be corrected in Jagdtigers, like adding a whole machine gun from the start, or even one at the back deck for close anti-infantry protection. Surviving Ferdinand crews were great tank killers with experience from the Eastern Front, and some of them would get the new Jagdtigers to operate. However, most of their problems from Ferdinands would still follow them. Now, the gun on the Jagdtiger, the 128mm in question, was long 7 meters from muzzle to breech, and because of this size and weight, it caused some unexpected problems. While moving across uneven ground, vibrations shook the massive barrel and stressed the gun mounting so much that it created shifts in alignment, which seriously affected the gun's accuracy. So to avoid losing gun zero every time when driving, the gun had to be locked in the big travel lock on the front and unlocked just during the combat. It could fire either high explosive or armor-piercing ammunition that was so long that it had to be loaded in 2 pieces and by 2 loaders. Just projectile alone weighed around 28 kilos. Amount of propellant could be adjusted depending on the range and shell type. Despite slow reloading time and just 38 rounds it could carry, Jagdtiger's firepower was simply unmatched. The gun could destroy any armored vehicle Allies had, at ranges beyond 3 kilometers, capable of penetrating over 200mm of armor at that distance. It didn't even matter if the tank is hit with armor-piercing or high-explosive shell, just the sheer size and force of 128mm round was enough. Production of Jagdtigers was plagued from the start to the end. If there were no drawbacks in its design, there were constant Allied bombings harassing them. Germans would manage to build just about 80 Jagdtigers as their main factories were heavily hit a couple of times. This also made a horrible situation for the Jagdtigers in the field as there were no spare parts. With constant delays and problems, Jagdtigers would not see combat until winter 1944 to 1945, originally set for the Ardennes offensive. However, most of them didn't even make it to the battlefield because of Germany's crumbling rail network and Jagdtigers' constant breakdowns on marches. But some of them did, and were ready to shock the Allies. In the height of the Battle of the Bulge, Patton's US Third Army was attacking a strategically important town of Chaumont. But unknown to the advancing Americans, the Germans were also advancing to Chaumont, as it was very important to both sides. 4 Jagdtigers arrived behind the front lines, shocking the Germans as they were unloaded from the train, since no one had ever seen or even heard of this new tank destroyer before. The Jagdtigers were immediately put to work and ordered to conceal themselves along the wooded ridge. In front of them was open terrain, and soon the American leading elements advanced forward, spearheaded by Sherman tanks. Germans waited until they were all well in their field of fire. Then, complete chaos ensued. Jagdtigers had a turkey shot, destroying at least 11 Shermans in quick succession and damaging many more, while surviving Shermans reversed out of the kill zone. Jagdtigers then continued to support the infantry and successfully halted Patton's advance, inflicting heavy losses while not a single Jagdtiger getting scratched. This significantly delayed the relief of US troops, and only a couple of months later, Americans realized what had actually decimated them that day at Chaumont. However, such successes were rather rare exceptions. The majority finally saw combat in Operation Nordwind in January 1945, where the first Jagdtiger was lost. Such a heavily armored beast was destroyed by a bazooka that went through the back and hit the ammunition, causing a huge internal explosion that killed the crew and blew up the tank destroyer. The biggest enemy to Jagdtigers, however, were themselves and the rapidly deteriorating conditions of the German army. With railways destroyed, they were forced to road marches, which didn't go quite well with their notorious transmission unreliability. Allied fighter-bomber aircraft had an easy job on huge, slow-moving targets. When they broke down, ran out of fuel, or got stuck, the Jagdtigers were blown up by their crews to prevent capture, as with much other German heavy equipment. Experienced crews were mostly killed or captured at this point, and highly complicated machines were now manned by young and inexperienced crews that already knew the war was not going in their favor. One Jagdtiger commander, during an engagement with American forces, knocked out a Sherman tank from an ideal fighting position. But when they started receiving fire from other tanks, he ordered the driver to turn the vehicle to flee, exposed its vulnerable side armor, and got a penetrating hit that killed the entire crew. Local civilians were warning Allies about tank destroyers laying in ambush ahead, and Allies would simply call in airstrikes on them before advancing. Simply put, the Jagdtigers, as many other German wonder weapons, arrived too little too late. For example, for the price and time needed to build one Jagdtiger, Germans could build 30 Hetzers. Although Hetzer was not the best tank destroyer, it was useful, and 3,000 of them instead of about 100 semi-working Jagdtigers could maybe actually make a difference. But we'll never know, and probably no weapon Germany built could actually change the outcome of the war. The story begins in 1940 with the German military looking for a breakthrough weapon. Porsche and Henschel companies were designing vehicles in the 30-ton class, but soon, with the emergence of heavier Soviet tanks, Hitler dramatically altered the entire German tank program, demanding heavier armor and the mounting of the famous 88mm flak gun for anti-tank purposes. These two companies were then competing for the future Tiger I. Ferdinand Porsche adapted his existing design to meet these new requirements, keeping his petrol-electric drive system. This system used two gasoline engines to power generators, which then produced electricity to run electric motors that actually moved the vehicle. In theory, this would remove the need for a complex mechanical transmission, but in practice, it would actually become the tank's biggest flaw. When the competing designs were demonstrated on Hitler's birthday in April 1942, the simpler and more reliable Henschel design proved much superior and was chosen for what would become the Tiger I. Porsche's creation suffered tremendously from overheating and engineering complexity and had to be cancelled. However, 100 Porsche chassis were already built, anticipating victory, and that is a lot of German steel and man-hours to be wasted during the war. Under intense wartime urgency, they got the idea to turn it into something else that also doesn't work properly, a heavy tank destroyer. And when we say heavy, we mean it couldn't cross almost any bridges with its 70-ton combat-ready weight. On 90 of the surplus chassis, they would weld a superstructure housing the new L-71 anti-tank gun. It had the same caliber, infamous 88mm like the one mounted on the Tiger I, but now with almost double the propellant charge and a longer barrel, giving it extreme muzzle velocity. It was actually the most powerful anti-tank gun the Germans had. It could easily destroy the heaviest Allied tanks at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards, where they could only dream of returning fire effectively. The new vehicle was officially named Ferdinand in honor of Ferdinand Porsche. However, it would later be renamed Elephant. Turns out, it would embarrass his name, and the upgraded version was renamed to clear connections with the early design. We'll come to that. The new vehicle was essentially a large, mobile anti-tank gun with very thick armor. The entire front hull and casemate were 200mm thick, making it impervious to any Allied gun. For comparison, this was almost twice the thickness of the already well-protected Tiger I. The sides were 80mm, also giving it solid protection, although not invincible. The Ferdinand was designed specifically for the Eastern Front and the impending battle at Kursk, where on wide-open terrain, it would use its extreme frontal armor and gun range to its advantage in tank-on-tank combat. But not everything would go according to plan. Battle. In April 1943, two heavy tank destroyer battalions were formed, each with 45 Ferdinands. They had their hurried training and were sent by train to the east. Ferdinand saw its first combat during Operation Citadel as the Germans began their offensive at Kursk. Here, all except one Ferdinand ever produced would be deployed. They were immediately pushed into battle, and initial results showed terrifying potential. A group of Ferdinands, on their very first day of combat, destroyed 22 Soviet tanks at ranges over 2 kilometers. Returning fire from Soviet T-34s, anti-tank guns, and later even from IS heavy tanks, harmlessly bounced off their frontal armor. They blasted through the first Soviet defenses and caused serious destruction in just a couple of days of combat. However, their war luck would be short-lived, as ominous problems with the Ferdinand quickly emerged. Because the offensive was delayed multiple times, the Soviets had time to prepare extensive defenses with deep minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and artillery positions. Without proper mine-clearing support, Ferdinands were lumbering through minefields and blowing their tracks off one by one. But that's not really the Ferdinand's fault. The biggest issue was Porsche's innovative but terribly unreliable gasoline-electric drive, combined with a notoriously fragile suspension system. Operating under the massive weight of the vehicle, the two engines, generators, and electric motors crammed into the hull midsection were prone to constant overheating. It was just a question of time before something broke and immobilized the destroyer. Top speed was about 18 miles per hour on the road, while cross-country it could only crawl. In ideal conditions, it had an operational range of just 90 kilometers, but in reality, it would usually break down before even going through one fuel tank. And now, under combat conditions, this was just multiplied. The electrical system was particularly vulnerable to water and battlefield debris, the kinds of things that are rather common in, well, a war. By the way, if you get stuck in mud or slide off the road, well, that's probably it. Due to Ferdinand's weight, recovering it was almost impossible. It needed between 3 and 5 recovery vehicles or other tanks to pull it out, and even that was sometimes impossible. So in that case, it had to be blown up by its own crew. In fact, most of them were not destroyed by the enemy, but by their own crews to prevent capture when they became bogged down. Just a couple of days after the beginning of the operation, out of 89 deployed Ferdinands, only 12 were still operational. A few of them were penetrated through the sides or rear, and a couple more destroyed by direct heavy artillery hits or infantry attacks. But the majority of them were stranded in no man's land with damaged running gear. Because it was so rushed to the front lines, many of the key features an armored fighting vehicle should have were completely overlooked. First, it didn't have any machine guns. Infantry was supposed to protect it from being swarmed by enemy troops. However, such a large target as Ferdinand attracted all nearby artillery fire, and infantry was reluctant to be beside it. They preferred to stay far behind, so the crews didn't have any means to protect their vehicle at close range. And there were multiple instances of Soviet infantry destroying Ferdinands with grenades or Molotov cocktails. But this was the least of its problems. Visibility from inside was catastrophic, and the engines in the middle section were extremely loud. The fighting compartment was spacious, yes, but during combat it quickly became extremely hot and filled with fumes. Maintenance was extremely difficult and complicated. Crews would sometimes spend the whole day fighting, then the entire night helping mechanics with repairs, and then go back into combat, only to break down or hit a mine almost immediately. However, the still operational Ferdinands continued to push during the battle around Kursk, usually used as spearhead units. They were met for the first time with the new Soviet heavy tank destroyer, the Su-152. In one recorded engagement, one Ferdinand was directly hit by an Su's 152mm howitzer shell, coming from about 3 kilometers away. But with superior optics and a precise gun, several Soviet Sus were destroyed in return. With each passing day, the Ferdinand's reliability issues multiplied, and only a couple of them were combat-ready at any given time, while the others awaited repairs. Despite the setbacks, the surviving Ferdinands would become more effective when the tide of war turned, and the German army was now on the retreating end. Now they served as rearguard defense, protecting retreats, and could decimate Soviet tank charges from defensive positions. Destroying them in head-on attacks was impossible, even at point-blank range, but being outmaneuvered was still the Ferdinand's biggest worry. The two Panzerjäger battalions repeatedly begged headquarters for maintenance time to perform serious work on their vehicles. Their pleas were ignored, as the retreating German army desperately needed every operational vehicle to plug holes in their collapsing front lines. Now, as the Eastern Front was slowly but surely collapsing, most of the Ferdinands were sent back by train, and a program was launched to improve them. 39 out of the 90 built were completely lost at this point. The retrofit program began addressing the most glaring weaknesses. A hull machine gun was added for close-quarter protection, the commander got his cupola for better visibility, and what could be done around the engines was slightly improved as well. The tank destroyer was now named the Elephant to clear the bad reputation it had gained as the Ferdinand. Meanwhile, lighter and supposedly more reliable and faster tank destroyers were developed to carry the new 88, like the Jagdpanther and the Jagdtiger. Although they had undoubtedly great guns and solid protection, they were all suffering under the rapidly deteriorating condition of the German army. Even before all the refits were complete, the Allies opened a new front in Italy with the landing at Anzio. Elephants were rushed to Italy to stop the Allied advance, and immediately new problems emerged. Italy's mountainous ground, soft soils, and ancient infrastructure didn't go quite well with the 70-ton Elephant. One was lost after attempting to cross an old stone bridge, which collapsed, and the Elephant crashed down. Another one slid off a narrow hillside road, was impossible to recover, and had to be destroyed with explosives. A couple more broke down, and this was even before reaching the enemy. The ones that finally reached the Allies began fighting a retreat toward Rome. A number of advancing Shermans were destroyed by well-defensively positioned elephants. However, Allied air supremacy wreaked havoc on the huge, slow-moving targets with fighter bombers, such as the feared P-47 Thunderbolt. At least 2 elephants were destroyed by 500-pound bombs, and constantly harassed German crews couldn't repair or recover the ones that broke down. Elephants were yet again abandoned and destroyed. One was captured intact and shipped to the United States for evaluation. The last of the surviving elephants were shipped back and formed into new units for the Eastern Front again. They saw heavy action in Ukraine, where problems didn't avoid them either. Springtime brought deep mud, where elephants would bog down and overheat trying to pull themselves out. However, they broke quite a few Soviet tank offensives when positioned correctly. By 1945, Germany was already fighting a lost war. Only 4 elephants were still semi-operational, but they weren't going to quit just like that. The last 4 elephants were positioned south of Berlin to guard approaches to the capital, essentially just delaying the inevitable Soviet advance. On April 22, 1945, 2 of the elephants engaged Soviet forces and fought until both of them broke down and were abandoned. The remaining 2 elephants retreated to Berlin to support the last-ditch defense. They took their positions in the city and knocked out several advancing Soviet assault guns. Now completely overrun, the final 2 elephant crews destroyed their vehicles and surrendered. ending its short but turbulent service. Only 2 Ferdinand/elephants survived the war. One is displayed in Russia, one in the United States. If you found this video interesting, check out our channel for more.